You're watching CHCO-TV's gavel-to-gavel coverage of the December 8, 2025 Special Council meeting for the Town of St. Andrews. I'm Florence Mitchell. In this meeting, the Southwest New Brunswick Service Commission will hold a public presentation for a draft zoning bylaw to accompany the municipal plan. So let's join Council at the W.C. O'Neill Arena Complex Council Chambers in St. Andrews.
We'll call together the special council meeting on Monday, December the 8th, 2025 at 6 p.m. at the W.C. O'Neill Arena Complex in Council Chambers. So recording of attendance, I know that Councillor Gumichel will not be here tonight. And anybody know what happened to Councillor Weir? He may be a little late. Oh yes, pen runs out. Councillor Weir. And is Councillor Blanchard online?
He is, yes.
Okay, so just those two. All right. We are on the unceded territory and traditional territory of the Beskotomakati people under the umbrella of the Luguistigwe people. And we welcome you to the lands. Approval of the agenda. Could I have a mover? Councillor Bennett, seconded by Deputy Mayor Neal. Do we need to add anything, Mr. Spear? Okay. All those in favor of accepting the agenda as motioned, say aye. Contrary minded? Carried. Is there a disclosure of interest from anybody? No, I don't see any. Presentation, we have the public presentation of the zoning bylaw by the Service New Brunswick's by South New Brunswick Service Commission, sorry. And that would be you, Xander. It's all yours.
Thank you, Your Worship. So I do have a presentation.
Your microphone?
I'll never get everything right the first time. So we're going to do a presentation. This is kind of the, we're not at any statutory step of the zoning bylaw yet, but there really isn't one to publicly introduce it like there is for the municipal plan, which we did the public presentation for, I can't remember how long ago. But so this is kind of supposed to be the same idea. We're kind of introducing the plan publicly. I'll give a high level overview of it. It is about a 70-page document, which for taking two rural plans and a zoning bylaw and making one document is pretty good, but it's still a fairly in-depth document. I think for the public, what will be most relevant is looking at maps, seeing zones, and I'll go through the zones in this presentation. Some of the general standards that might be a little bit new. I'll provide before the actual zoning bylaw itself and those kind of the overview of that. I'll give a little bit of context of how we got here. I'll talk about the overall concept. There's some review from the municipal plan. And then I'll talk quickly about some of the general standards that apply to specific land uses. I'll talk about the zones. And then I'll also provide a comparison to the current zones. So the current zones that exist within the Bayside Rural Plan, Shamcook Rural Plan, and Z2201, the current zoning bylaw for the town of St. Andrews. And then I'll talk about some potential next steps for how to get more public input on the document before anything else that council wants to do with it. So the zoning bylaw is the primary implementation tool of the municipal plan, and we've been going through a municipal plan bylaw process. I guess we started over a year ago in the fall with some public surveys and things like that, which led to background reports. But the zoning bylaw is really the key implementation tool of the municipal plan. And that became very clear in a lot of the public consultation we did with the municipal plan. People really wanted to know about the zones, the permitted land uses, the dimensional and design standards, and the general standards for specific land uses. It's not something the municipal plan gets super into. So the new zoning bylaw is for the whole municipality. It can't just be for one part of it. And why is this happening now? Well, some of the rural plans are quite old, and we have been dealing with land use conflicts as a result of those older rural plans. The province, when they initiated local governance reform, set a deadline of January 1st, 2028 to have new municipal plans and zoning bylaws for the entire municipal areas of the new of all the new municipalities. And even though Z 2201 isn't that old, it's kind of been patched together a little bit since 2018, and could definitely use some work as well. There's also a specific piece of legislation from the province called the Statements of Public Interest, which I've spoken about before, that any planning document needs to conform with, and the zoning bylaw certainly needs to as well. So the bylaw draft is kind of, we're trying to meet the statements of public interest. We have the background study that we did for the municipal plan. We have all of the information we've gotten through the municipal plan process, because we've done more public consultation than that initial round. And so that's kind of we try and take all that and start with this draft. And then it'll go through the process again, and the draft that ends up being passed, I'm sure won't look exactly like this. This is just the starting point. So just a quick geographical refresher. Bayside has the rural plan from 2009, as well as the St. Croix Corridor South Rural Plan. The subdivision bylaw, which was passed in 2023, was the first land use bylaw for the entire municipal area, but it only regulates new subdivisions. It doesn't do anything else for land use, and then doesn't really deal with anything once you get to the property level. Shamcook, very similar, an older rural plan. St. Croix Corridor South Rural Plan, and the subdivision bylaw as well. Within the former municipal boundaries, there's the municipal plan 20-01 from 2020, zoning bylaw Z2201, which kind of is from 2018, and then got a more significant refresher in 2022. Secondary municipal plan, which deals with the town plat and historic business district, and the subdivision bylaw. So except for the subdivision bylaw and the municipal plan, all of this is kind of being, it's not that we're taking those exact plans, but those are the areas we need to cover with the zoning bylaw. This is, again, from the background study process, the public, the kind of objectives of the municipal plan, the continued delivery of high-quality public services and infrastructure, protection and conservation of the physical environment, including protection of the Shamcook Lake drinking watershed, mitigating and adapting to the impacts of climate change, including erosion and sea level rise, developing housing that meets the needs of all residents, specifically housing that is affordable, preservation of rural way of life and rural economic development, including promotion of local agriculture, tourism that supports local residents and businesses without straining resources, and maintaining the historically significant character of the St. Andrews area. So just like with the municipal plan, which is trying to achieve all of these objectives, the zoning bylaw is doing it in a more targeted way, but it is still trying to meet all of those objectives. So the overall concept is a bit of a new one, I think, at least for St. Andrews. And instead of kind of vague rural plans and incredibly specific zones within the former municipal boundaries, we've taken an approach of saying, let's look at the capacity of the land in terms of the environment, it could be the built infrastructure that exists there that has access to your pipes in the ground, that kind of thing. So what is the capacity of the land, and what is the intensity of the use? So you will notice that there's no longer a residential zone or a commercial zone, and you see more things like low intensity, high intensity, urban settlement, rural settlement. That's to address kind of what is the reality on the ground, is that you don't end up with discrete land uses. You do almost everywhere have some mixing of land uses, even if it's home-based businesses. So rather than have zones that are talking about discrete land uses, it's, in staff's opinion, more accurate to actually talk about the intensity of uses and then scale those based on the area it's in. And I'll talk more about that, and you'll see how it works in the actual zones. Z2201 is incredibly complicated. It's a much longer document than the zoning bylaw that is the draft, even though it's for a much smaller geographical area. It's incredibly difficult to administer, even for somebody like myself who was involved in the drafting of it. There are still sections that I have to remind myself to triple check issuing a permit, because you might have to look at parking section for a commercial zone as well as the actual zone itself and the land use. And the sign section, we have I think a very improved sign, while still very regulatory for the urban area. The sign section itself, I think, is about 10 pages currently, and it's as difficult, if not more difficult, to administer than the entire zoning bylaw. On the flip side, the rural plans were very general, with really only 3 zones in each rural plan: a watershed zone, which basically says whatever the Clean Water Act allows in the Shamcook drinking watershed area, you can do that as long as you get a permit for it from the Department of Environment. And in the rural zone, you can do pretty much anything up to industrial. So you could do a light industrial use, agriculture, residential, commercial, forestry, very vague. And maybe at the time that those plans were written, that worked, but there's been a fair amount of development since 2009 and 2011, almost 15 years. And the needs of the area don't seem to be being met by that level of vague planning anymore. There are, while this is a plan for the entire municipality, there is the reality of having distinct urban service areas with municipal services, which allow for much greater density of uses, of population. So there are policies, standards, that apply only within the urban service boundary. And I won't talk about every single general standard, but on the next page I will talk about some that are kind of new or different. And there are a few with asterisks that only apply in the urban service boundary. So limits on light pollution. This is really only dealing with permanent lighting fixtures that are typically installed at the time of development. I know there's been some questions about like light displays and windows and in the commercial zone and things like that. That's really not what a zoning bylaw deals with, but for industrial uses, there can be significant light pollution that does occur from permanent lighting. So the zoning bylaw can deal with that, and that's proposed. We're actually, just before the meeting, there was some questions from a counselor about a property that was doing some shoreline protection, and it's very clearly spelled out in the proposed bylaw that if that is changing more than a meter, then PAC would have to be involved. And there's some encouragement, although not requirement, of what's called green shore protection, which is encouraging use of vegetation and maybe more landscaping approaches and interventions than just armor stone engineering, which in the long run do work a little bit better. And we actually have somebody in our office who's getting some training in those techniques. Agriculture, livestock, and backyard hens. It kind of scales within different zones. So there's some zones where the agriculture is very limited. Like in most of the urban zones, it's really just limited to backyard hens, depending on how much space you have, very similar to how it is now. Once you get into the rural areas, there's more allowance for livestock, but it does scale with property size, and there's requirements, general standards that various aspects of that land use be certain distances from wells, water courses, property lines, other things like that. And it's really based on the Provincial Agriculture Operations Practices Act. They're a very engaged department, the Department of Agriculture, and they have very specific animal units, so how they define nutrient loads from different types of animals. So those definitions are really important. And what's also really nice about using their definitions and their standards is that if anything goes above those, it has to be licensed by the province as a livestock operation, which is dealt with entirely by the province. If there's ever issues with it, it's all under that license, and there's an appeal body just to deal with those things. So we know there's been issues with more livestock in the rural areas and maybe less care than there should be. So having these types of standards are really important. One thing that does come up from time to time, people say, well, does that mean people are going to be coming and checking on my properties and counting how many chickens I have? And realistically, no. The standards exist so that if there are issues, we can do enforcement. If there are no standards, there's no potential for enforcement. But if you're keeping your animals in such a way that it's not bothering your neighbors, that's really not something that we think the municipality needs to get involved in. It's when there's issues, then you need those standards. Resource uses, it's kind of the same thing. You have these more intensive uses that can have significant impacts on neighboring properties, and there are provincial guidelines and kind of best practices. So that's what we recommend in the general standards. Now, again, these would not be allowed anywhere. They're only in specific zones. And I'll talk about the different uses allowed in the different zones when we get there. Campgrounds is another area where actually there is no provincial regulation or standards. There used to be, and then the province stopped regulating them, and there has been a proliferation and maybe some issues as a result. So the way we're proposing this works is that it kind of scales. And if you have a single camp on your property, like if you have your trailer, your RV, that's a private camp. You're living there. It's really not that different from a dwelling. The issues start to come when you have multiple campers, multiple cabins, things like that, and maybe there isn't an owner living on site. So if you have more than one camp, then it becomes a campground, and there's standards that apply for campgrounds. They're not allowed in every zone. That's an approach we've seen work well in other rural areas. Subdivisions, there are these what we identified in the municipal plan as low-intensity rural areas, and I'll show you maps in a second, but they're kind of further from the road on the 127, but still where there's not quite acre by acre development, but there's a fair amount of homes leading down to the water and things like that. So making sure that those areas just don't become acre by acre lots, and there's still some of that space that you get in those areas currently. So it's kind of maintaining some of that character. Mini home parks and bare land condos. These would be like land lease communities. So they're a way to develop multiple dwelling units on a property without having to subdivide the property. and they aren't something we see. Mini home parks, there's a few in Eastern Charlotte, but it's a kind of similar concept. What we haven't seen is, and what this would allow for is using a piece of property in a more efficient way. So most properties are not just flat acres that don't have any environmental features. Usually there's something that you need to work around to develop. And if you have a property that you're just dividing acre by acre, not every lot will be equal when you finish. One might have a wetland on it, which limits developable area. So the idea is this is a way to have dwelling units be closer together than one per acre, but there's still the requirement of having the number of dwelling units times the number of acres. So you can cluster your developments closer together, but you're still going to have sufficient space to make sure there's enough water resources on the lot and enough space for your septic disposal fields and things like that. Landscaping and drainage, and this is only a requirement in the urban service boundary. And for new developments, there's not really the requirement to get drainage plans at this point. If there's a subdivision involved, then the municipality is getting drainage plans and things like that. But it's a bit ambiguous if you just have a single dwelling being developed. And there certainly are issues that can result from improper lot grading and drainage. So we're proposing that new developments do require landscaping and drainage plans. Doesn't have to be engineered. There's a certain threshold for that for your larger, more significant developments. And so this is something a surveyor could do, basically just showing that any water that comes onto the lot from stormwater is going to stay on the lot, go into municipal storm sewer systems, and essentially not go on to neighboring properties. That's where the issues come from. So just a little bit more oversight for that. And I think a kind of brand new thing is actually putting design standards in for higher density institutional, residential, and townhouses. I guess townhouses actually do have some standards in the current zoning bylaw in terms of, how many units you can have before there needs to be a break in the block. And that's having those standards in a bylaw can allow those types of developments to happen without everything coming to council for rezonings or going to PAC for variances if there's ambiguity in how the wording is, or maybe it was a terms and conditions thing before, and PAC would apply the same terms and conditions every time. So what a lot of municipalities are doing now is putting more design standards specifically for higher density residential developments to make them fit into neighborhoods better. So making sure that they have front doors that face the street, landscaping, pedestrian areas going to front doors. So you can have higher density developments in existing residential areas, kind of more lower density without them looking particularly different. And there's certainly some of these which have just happened in St. Andrews. There's some older homes which have been converted into apartment buildings. And from the street, it's you really can't tell that they are apartment buildings. So those are just some of the general standards. Those are really I think the big ones that are maybe different and more in the rural areas. I think there's probably a little bit more introduction of general standards there. This is the zoning map, and like with the municipal plan, we basically have it ready to go. We have a kind of virtual digital version of that, so you can search for your property, zoom in, really kind of get detailed. The paper version and PDFs are never quite as good. If you've been following along with the municipal plan, the rural areas probably are not that surprising, and they kind of match the municipal plan policy areas with conservation, rural resource, low intensity settlement, and rural settlement, and the industrial area, really just the industrial park and some of the Tuddenham property. It's, I think, within the urban service boundary where the municipal plan basically said this is the urban service boundary, where now you can actually see some proposed zoning ideas. And at this point, they're really just ideas. And, absolutely nothing is set in stone. So the basic concept for the plat is where there are collector streets, so it's really Montague and Parr, as well as King and Augustus, and I want to say Reed. I think it's Reed. Your kind of bigger streets within the plat, those would have U2 zoning around them, and then everything else except for the historic business district gets the U1 zoning, unless there's a use already existing that requires the U2 zoning. But this is kind of just a first concept idea, and I'll talk about the zones a little bit too. It's always hard to figure out where in the presentation you introduce the maps, introduce the zones, because they all kind of talk to each other. So I'll go through the zones now, but I think definitely take some time to go through the zoning map. If you think it should be different, it's totally, we can play around with it. We're not close to being set in stone yet, and we haven't gotten too far with the municipal plan either, where if there's changes we need to make to that based on things we need to change here, we can make those changes. So the C1 zone, that's the high priority conservation zone. That's kind of your most restrictive zone that really only allows for conservation, a public utility use, and a pre-existing use. So there might be some of these areas where there is a camp or a cottage already, and this zoning bylaw shouldn't make it so that it's absolutely impossible to develop that use further. And so the pre-existing use is a bit stronger property right than your grandfathered use. But this zone really is around watercourses, wetlands, and the Zone A and Zone B of the Shamcook watershed, where you have really strong restrictions on development from the province anyways. C2, that's kind of more of your it is called the low priority conservation zone. So it allows for some, fairly low intensity residential uses, as well as some secondary uses. It's more for Zone C of the Shamcook watershed, which is the majority of it. And at parkland, things like that. I-zone, that's industrial. This one's pretty straightforward. It's really for the industrial park and those other couple properties up on the 127, where there's some solid waste stuff and warehousing going on. So this is the most intense zone. It's where you have industrial uses. You could also, there could be utility resource excavation, certainly something happening in the current industrial zone in the Bayside rural plan. It does allow for some secondary uses like large-scale commercial uses. One thing we've noticed more and more with industrial land uses is that there'll be a need for temporary residential things for workers who are coming in, for big ships coming into the port, or there's big development happening, and they're going to need to bring in workers for a certain amount of time. So that's not a clearly allowed use now, but dwellings would be a secondary use in this case. The low intensity rural zone, not too different from the C1 zone, although what it does, the C2 zone, so you've got basically just residential uses. It does start to allow secondary agriculture, forestry, institutional uses, and small-scale commercial uses. That would be pretty limited, no more than 3 employees. So those could be main uses, but they have to be under 200 square meters. So they're limited in size. R2, that's the one along the 127, the rural settlements. So the idea is it would be a little bit more intensive. So you can do all those same residential uses. And then you can do the agriculture, forestry, institutional. Now it's a large-scale commercial use, so you're not as limited by employees. You're also able to do any of those up to 500 square meters. So it's the potential for a more significant development, but really limiting it to along the road. And this is also where if you're going to have significant 1 acre lot subdivisions, they should be happening in this zone. R3 is the rural resource zone, and this is for larger lots. The minimum lot size would be 5 acres. It's really, the idea is to preserve land for activities that need large amounts of land. Because they're going to either be relying on that land base, like agriculture or forestry, or resource excavation, and they also have the potential for significant impacts. And in this case, we're not actually limiting any of those. So they could be quite large. There would be general standards for agriculture, for the resource excavation. So just because it's an allowed use doesn't mean it can happen anywhere in any way. There's still those general standards. But that's what this zone is for. It doesn't allow main residential uses, but that doesn't mean you can't develop a residential use here as long as you're doing one of those main uses. And the requirement isn't that these be commercial scale uses. So it's, I think, quite likely that almost anybody who wants to live in this area is going to be engaging in one of those main uses in some way. And so then it would be very easy to develop residential use. As well, it does have the pre-existing use. So if there's an existing residential use, that use can continue, expand, has a lot more rights than a grandfathered or legally non-conforming use, which is not allowed through zoning. Okay, so that's the kind of more rural areas. Getting into the urban now. So U1, that's the low intensity urban settlement. I would say it's most closely related to the serviced residential zone now. And I do have a comparison chart at the end. So this is really just residential with some secondary things like home-based businesses, institutional uses. In this case, that's probably like a small daycare, your accessory dwelling unit, and a secondary short-term rental unit. So if a short-term rental unit is secondary, that means there has to be a main residential use on the property. It cannot be a standalone short-term rental. Yeah. So there's some zones that allow short-term rentals as secondary uses. The secondary uses cannot occur unless there is a main use on the lot. So one thing that came up in a lot of the municipal plan discussions was how will the zoning bylaw deal with short-term rental uses? And I think the municipal plan in the current draft is saying council should maybe consider a bylaw to regulate them on its own, or advocate to the province to have provincial regulations. But in the zoning bylaw, deal with them, not say they aren't allowed, but say they have to be a secondary use unless it's in your highest intensity urban zone. So the U2 zone, and this, from a residential point of view, I think it's kind of like your MR1 zone now. It also allows for institutional uses and a main small-scale commercial use. So that would be like a neighborhood commercial use, hair salon, maybe small food service. But again, you're limited in employees, and it can't be more than 200 square meters. Does allow for secondary home-based businesses as well, and the short-term rental. The U3 zone, this is the highest intensity urban zone, and it's taking aspects of the central commercial zone, high density residential, institutional, a tourist commercial, that's another zone that currently exists. So it allows for residential uses, pretty much as they can be developed for the lot standards, institutional uses, medium scale commercial uses. Nothing in the urban service boundaries allows for large scale commercial uses, which are really more for auto oriented, big box, that type of thing. So the idea is really keep things that could be walkable within the urban service boundary and things that definitely are car oriented. They belong more outside of the urban service boundary. So those are the main zones. And there's a few special zones or overlay zones. The ID zone, or integrated development zone, was introduced at some point into Z22. I can't remember which amendment that was, but there's been a few developments that really just didn't fit into Z2201, the Algonquin Spa and Dormitory, and the pocket neighborhood that Harbortown is proposing to develop. So the ID zone was already created in the previous zoning bylaw, and it's kind of you apply to council for a rezoning, and the zone is determined through that process. So council gets to set all the parameters in discussion with the developers. There's public consultation. So that's just an option that is being put into this zoning bylaw. The historic business district overlay zone is kind of the replacement for the historic business district secondary plan. It deals with land uses in the first 10 meters of the ground floor, requiring commercial uses. So this would be on Water Street. This is in the secondary municipal plan, actually in the zoning bylaw now. There's also design standards. This is kind of the secondary municipal plan aspect for amount of windows on the ground floor, things like cornices, cladding materials. So those are all things that exist within the secondary municipal plan now. What is unique about this zone and why it kind of is the replacement for the secondary municipal plan? The secondary municipal plan, everything goes to council. It's not something that can be varied. And there might be, very minor variances that could happen in this zone and very minor developments, like accessory uses, things like that happen without council's approval. But the second statement here is basically saying, unless you're doing something really, really minor, you have to go through a development scheme bylaw process with council. So it's like a rezoning for if you want an extension, if you want a new building, if you want to change your facade significantly. All these things come to council for rezonings. We've heard pretty clearly from council that you feel like you don't have enough control over what happens in the historic business district, and this is a way to have, I don't want to say total control, but a very significant amount of control. There may be some discussion on how far this overlay zone extends. So right now we kind of have it aligned with the current historic business district, but I've heard some concerns that maybe that isn't actually quite far enough, and there's some buildings that people think should be in it that aren't, and so things happen there. So that's certainly up for discussion.
Before you jump out of there, I just want to, so council understands, so essentially, any project is going to require 3 readings of a bylaw?
Yeah. and a public hearing.
Okay.
So, I think this is the last overlay zone. Natural hazard. This is kind of the sea level rise zone. It deals with the projected high tide line for 2100 and the projected 1% worst case scenario storm surge for 2100. So the I guess the high priority, that's the one, the red. Those are your high tide areas. And so requirements that basically everything is elevated above a certain elevation above sea level rise. That's based on provincial data. There are certain things you can still do in those areas, but it is pretty limited. Because this is just, I guess, a bit more of design. I didn't actually talk about the way the bylaw may look a little bit different. The current zoning bylaw is really just text and maybe a few diagrams here and there. This is a much more visual document, and instead of having tables with standards, dimensional standards that you can maybe try and imagine, you can see, I'll just go back, just the U3 zone, we have actually kind of a template site plan that shows all the setbacks and things like that so that people can have a much better idea of what they can actually do with their lot and visualize it better. One of the other, I think, process improvement ideas in this bylaw is quick reference tables. So sometimes rather than looking at a zone and wanting to know what you can do in that zone, you just want to know, can I do this use? So this is a way to kind of get a quick sense of that. You can review a lot of the common uses and see which zones they're allowed in. Maybe they're allowed just completely by right. Maybe they have some limitations on them. Signs, we did the same thing just because signs are very complicated. At least in the urban service boundary. So we wanted to make it a little bit easier to figure out where you could do different things. So I touched on this a little bit already. How does everything compare? What is changing? I don't think I can really say every single thing that has changed. And I think it is important for property owners to review these and really get a sense of how this could impact them. In some cases, it's probably very minor. So what I have here on the left is the new proposed zones in Z25, and on the right are the current zones in the rural plans and Z22. And this is kind of my own analysis of it, but the C1 high priority conservation zone is taking aspects of the watershed zone from the rural plans, the St. Croix corridor, and the environmental significant area zone in Z22. So all of those zones do things very similar to what the C1 zone is proposing to do. C2 zone, which is the lower priority conservation, whereas the watershed zone was really saying whatever the province says you can do, this is going one step further and saying where the province says you can do this, you can do this. Where the province says you can do this, you can do this. Minister's Island had some interesting kind of recreation, conservation type zoning. The green space zone in Z22 and Navy Island were both zones. Well, Navy Island allowed for very, very limited residential development. The green space zone was kind of parks, recreation. So each of those aspects is something that is in the C2 zone. The industrial zone, it's the industrial zone from Bayside. But there were actually a lot of things that you could do in some of the rural areas that over time, it just seems like it's less appropriate to do those things in rural areas, and so those would shift to the industrial zone in Z25. The low intensity rural settlement. If you remember before, I said the rural zones were really vague, really open. So aspects of those have been kind of split up into multiple zones, as you can start to see from the I-1. So some of those are kind of your more just pure residential uses, and those are going into R1. The estate residential zone was unserviced residential development in the former municipal areas. So typologically, it's not that different from what might be just across the boundary or the former boundary. So a lot of those aspects have been incorporated into the R1 zone. The R2 zone is also incorporating aspects of that rural Bayside Shamcook zone. And it's maybe the closest to that in a pure sense. The R3 is, again, in that rural zone, you could do agriculture, you could do forestry. There was some level of resource development that could happen. These are things that we're saying actually really should, if they're at a large enough scale, should be in their own zone, and that's the R3 zone. Getting into the urban zones, U1 I already mentioned looks very similar to the serviced residential zone. That's most of what's in the plat currently. Similar lot standards, similar allowed uses. There's also, there's a bit of wiggle room where you might have some lots that have one service. So there's, in the U1 zone, there's provisions for service lots and provisions for unserviced lots. U2 is taking aspects of the mixed use zone, which really took aspects of all the other zones in Z22. The MR1 zone, which was the multi-residential, but not your high density. So your small apartment buildings in the town plat, your 5 to 8 units type of thing. And the institutional zone used to be its own thing. So you'd have schools, you'd have churches, NBCC, a lot of things that actually had very different intensities of uses. And so we've kind of split the institutional zone up and scaled it. So institutional uses, like some of the other ones, they can scale. So U3, where you have your highest intensity of uses, you're kind of pulling from these other high intensity use zones, your central commercial, which is a very much a mixed use zone. It's, allows for residential, commercial, and institutional uses. If you look, I didn't do it here, it's going to take too long, but the document that I have provided to council with this zone comparison also has this kind of analysis of each of the rural plans and zoning bylaws, so you can see how many different allowed uses were in the central commercial zone. I think it was like 30 or something, but if it wasn't one of those 30, then you couldn't do it. So it was a little strange, and then all of those uses were allowed in the tourist commercial zone, but only if you had a residential use, then you couldn't be in the tourist commercial zone. So that doesn't make a ton of sense. The MR2 zone, your high density multiple residential. From a land use point of view, there's not a ton of difference between a hotel and an apartment building. An apartment building might be less intense because you have less back and forth, but your hotels probably get quieter in the winter. The service, residential, and culture zone, which only was for Kira, was a very strange zone, which was not really a residential zone. It was mostly for the Kira Amphitheater, which was classified as an accessory use for some reason. So that kind of amphitheater type use or artist residence, that can be a fairly high intensity use. So that also belongs in the U3. And from a map point of view, that where you've got the Algonquin, Kingsbray, Kira, that creates kind of a contiguous U3 zone, and then some aspects of the institutional zone as well, some of the larger scale ones like NBCC. So you obviously want to go back and look at the map. I think the virtual zoning map is super, super helpful. And I think that the town will be posting all of this on their website, possibly tomorrow. If there's overall feedback, concerns, or support, I think contacting council is the best thing to do so that council has records of everything. Well, one of the things we did for the municipal plan was we went through all the public feedback and gave council a document saying, here's everything we've heard, here's our response, here's recommended changes or not. So we do the same thing for the zoning bylaw. If there's, more questions, like you want to know what does this mean for my property, I'm probably the best person to talk to. And at least in our staff discussions, our hope was, this is really just the introduction. There's not really the public here, although the public will certainly hear about it through CHCO, which is great. But doing a more in-depth public information feedback where we can really get into discussions and back and forth and answer in-depth questions, like we did for the municipal plan, we'd like to do that for the zoning bylaw as well, and that's a really good way to get public feedback. So I'm going to stop because I think that was a lot.
Thank you, Xander, for a great presentation. Councillor, you got any comments right now? Or you want to wait till later? Councillor Harland, I forgot your name, sorry.
So Xander, you mentioned that property owners really need to take a look at the zoning maps and really see where their property fits
Yeah.
to understand the implications of this. I guess I think that's really important, and I'm sure that the online maps, I haven't looked at them yet. I haven't looked at the online. I've only looked at the paper maps, and the paper maps are quite flat. Like it.
Yeah, we'll also
they're not
we'll
dynamic.
print out bigger versions and we can leave them in the town office. So
Right.
that'll help with that.
But in terms of the feedback that we're looking for from the public, if the public are not, if people are not happy with the zoning recommendations, like there's an overall plan to it. I guess I'm trying to understand, what are we seeking from the public?
I think it's both. I think it's there may be some people who have specific concerns with their property and they only care about their property. That's their interest. But then there's other folks who there's various stakeholders. So the development community, developers are, they're going to care about a lot of different things and different properties. I think you'll have, we know through all the public consultation that we do that people love St. Andrews and care very deeply about it, and they want to see it grow in the best way possible. So I think that's important too, and maybe there's some historical context that folks know. I think there's some aspects of things, and this is why the responses to the public comments are important. There are some things, and as I said in the beginning, some of this concept is based on provincial requirements.
Right.
So there are some things that I think there is less ability for council to change.
Right. And we saw that in terms of the discussion around the municipal plan.
Yeah.
Certainly around the watershed
Yeah.
and and helping people to understand the implications of that and what we're recommendations from the planners versus provincial regulations, et cetera. What is a bit different is the statements of public interest, which is it's an excellent document, and it's been in place for a couple of years now, I think, 2, maybe?
2020, January 1st, 2023.
Okay. But those hold a fair bit of weight, because those are provincial standards.
Yeah.
In terms of what the province is saying, thou shalt.
Planning documents must do
Okay.
this. Yeah.
And I think that's a bit of a shift, because we haven't operated with those
Yeah.
prior to.
Yeah, before, like when we did MP20, it was, did you follow the process that the Community Planning Act lays out? Did you
Right.
make sure you had the public presentation, the public hearing? There's, a municipal plan has to address all of these things. But now with the statements of public interest, you don't just have to address housing, you have to provide diverse housing options.
Right. And I think that that's a shift for the public in terms of understanding what the process was previously to what the process is now, and how this document looks different. I don't know that I think we need to continue to underscore that, because I think that that's a fundamental shift in understanding for people, for the general public.
Yeah.
I mean, even myself, even though I've been looking as a member of PAC, I've been working with the statements of public interest. It's layers of understanding around the implications of that document.
Even in our office, there's some things where like, do we give this development permit because of a statement of public interest? And
Right.
no, yes, we do. If we're giving a development permit, we don't look at them. But planning documents, and you're right, it is different. When we did this before, we weren't talking about the province.
Right.
We might be talking about best planning practices.
Right.
But that's not quite the same as the province is saying you have to do this, and a professional planner is going to have to sign off on the document saying it does meet all these statements.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Anyone else? Councillor Weir?
Yes, you mentioned to make the municipality grow and economic development and all the things that are required for a vibrant community. But with all the restrictions we've put on, I understand the historic district, but even if someone wanted to put a shopping mall out on the Ghost Road, I think there would be a hue and cry that would approach World War III. But, what type, we all talk about economic development, but what type of development do we want? I just can't get a grasp on what people are talking about when they talk about economic development. It seems as though everything you look at, and I mentioned this at the last council meeting, that I went across the province a few weeks ago, and it's phenomenal what's going on in communities because they don't have such severe restrictions. Putting up apartment buildings and stores and commercial outlets, and everything's booming. But I attributed part of it to the demographics. We have an older population who aren't interested in going in business, or some of them aren't. But at the same time, I'm scared this is just going to restrict it to the point where we're always going to be crying about economic development, but yet we're just people just come in and look at it and say, well, I can go do that in St. Stephen, or I can go do that in Fredericton, much easier than I can in St. Andrews.
I think that's a good point. The historic business district, you know, I don't know if that's a good idea. It's something I've heard from council a lot, that, or at least enough councilors that, you know, there should be more oversight of that. But there absolutely would be developers who look at that and say, I don't want to deal with this at all. And I think St. Andrews has in the past had a reputation as being a difficult place to develop. I think, especially with this council, there's been a lot of pretty big developments, but almost all of them have come to council, and it's slowed them down. And maybe council sees a value in that and what has been added to those projects because of council oversight, and they seem to be happening. Although there's some I can say, you know, they didn't happen because of this. So this is kind of what you're balancing, and in terms of economic development, you are, with the zoning bylaw, the things that you say can just happen without council getting involved or PAC getting involved, that's encouraging economic development. The things where you say we need oversight, that's going to discourage economic development. But you don't just want economic development. You want a place that's really nice to live. You know, there's all sorts of ways to have economic development. So I think there's a balance, and I feel like with the zoning bylaw, there's certain places where council is turning up the control, and there's certain places where they're turning it down. And I think on the balance, you know, the historic business district, it's pretty developed already. There's not a lot of potential for new development, for infill. But there is more potential for that in the town plat. And so this would make it a little bit easier to develop some things in the town plat, but it would make it harder to develop them in the historic business district.
But there's a contradiction. You say you don't want economic development that's, well, glitzy or whatever. You want a great place to live and all that type of thing. But what, are you just going to have retirement people
No,
living
I don't
there?
think so.
Well, where are they going to work? The tourism sector is a poverty industry. Employees in the tourism sector
Yeah.
make poverty wages, below poverty wages probably. And, you know, I've heard a lot of complaints about the quarry. I've got enough myself. I live right across from them. But by the same token, in the last 25 years, they've brought over $200 million into this county. And, you know, I hear people complaining about light pollution. I hear people complaining about noise on the weekend because there's a ship in and they can operate. No ship in, they got to be closed down. But there's a give and take. Mm-hmm. There's always give and take. And it can't all be take. It can't all be, I want this perfect place to live. But we all can't work at the post office or the biological station or Huntsman or whatever.
Yeah.
And the high-paying jobs are in heavy industrial. They're not in the tourism industry. And
Yeah.
I know the province is very high on the tourism industry. I attended a caucus meeting, and they explained it to me very quickly and very easily. They said it's strictly because of the HST. They get their sales tax on almost every penny of tourism dollars spent. So that's why they love tourism. And I have nothing against tourism. I think it's a great industry, and but it does have a weakness: the wages of the employees working in that sector.
And it might not be a year-round business either.
And it's seasonal
So, yeah.
on top of that. So,
That's, I mean, all of these things, I think we're trying to balance in the municipal plan and the zoning bylaw. And if you don't think we're doing a good job of it, that's totally fair and reasonable. But I think that is really what we are trying to do. And, you know, we're not actually trying to make everybody happy, because that's impossible. But it is the nice thing about having the statements of public interest, that the province is saying these are the things that are the most important that you need to focus on. And you know, having land that can be developed for resources, that's something the province feels very strongly about. So I think we've struck a good balance, but this is, you know, we're putting it out now to kind of get council feedback, public feedback. We'll have to get provincial feedback as well.
well, I think the residents' feedback, we've got to put a tremendous effort into it and make sure we know how they're thinking. We've got to get the message out to them as to what's, some of them aren't very proactive, and we can blame them for being that, but that's human nature. And particularly in the rural district, and I think it's true in town also. But we do have to go out and let them know. And you mentioned resident or resource development. I own 200 million tons of granite. Think I'll ever get to mine it and sell it?
Not anytime soon if you haven't started now. Takes a long time.
Thank you, Sander, and thank you, Councillor Weir. Anybody else? Mr. Spear, sorry.
Hi, Zen, I just wanted to, just for clarity on the map purposes.
Yeah.
Over the last couple of 3 years, we've had a couple or three ID zones identified. So, look, I guess the biggest one would be the Algonquin.
Yeah.
So, will they still be considered under their own, or are they going to be kind of zoned under the the R3?
So what happens when you repeal and replace a zoning bylaw is you can choose any previous zoning amendments and their development agreements or their schedules to save and accept. That's the technical language. So if you have a rezoning to an ID zone that had that list of here's the requirements, that's one you want to save and accept so that all those requirements still apply. And we actually did that in here, so.
But there's not, I guess what I was wondering is, so with that one again, other developers aren't going to look at that, so it was allowed around the Algonquin, it's going to be allowed in another R3 zone?
No,
I think
not necessarily, no.
Okay, and so how will they know the difference?
The ID zone, so there's no, like if,
I guess my point is just, they are their own unique thing, spot zoning is what we used to call it.
Yeah.
And it's just be good that people still understand, in my opinion. I know the more colors you have in a map, the worse it makes it feel, but
Yeah.
nonetheless, when there's special case circumstances, I'm wondering if those should still be identified, so people understand, you know, or someone comes in and says, well, that they aren't following the conditions
Yeah.
under the normal zone, why, then if they stand up by themselves, at least it,
yeah, so they could go, I mean, we could zone them as ID zone now, and it could even say on the map, ID zone subject to Z 2210 or whatever it was.
but so to take it one step further though, the conditions of the ID zone, again, back at the Algonquin.
Yeah.
don't necessarily flow through all the other
No,
things.
no, and
And
I
that's
mean,
why
even-
and that's why I think it might be good to somehow have those differentiate, that's me anyway, maybe it's up for discussion in the future, but maybe as a
Yeah, I mean, you could
discussion
almost
point.
have like ID1, ID2, ID3, because you have, the conditions you have for the Algonquin would make no sense for the Harbor Town pocket community.
Well, yeah. Sorry.
No, I know what you mean.
Thank you, Mr. Spear. Thank you, Alexander, again. Does Mr. Blanchard, Councilor Blanchard have anything to say? He's online, right? I just don't see his hand.
Sandra, can you stop sharing?
Oh, I thought I did.
Oh, actually, yeah, you did.
He did.
Sorry.
All right, I'm good, Your Worship. I couldn't find the button on my, on my Zoom.
I just didn't want to leave you out. So,
Good,
thank
thank
you,
you.
Councilor Blanchard. All right. Thank you, Alexander. I
Yeah,
think you
you're
can
very
close
welcome.
up and go home.
Yeah,
Drive safe.
I will.
Oh, sorry, Councilor Harlan's got one more question for you.
Just in terms, I know this is for us to discuss and obviously put a plan in place, but I mean, what we did with the municipal plan was we had a series of public consultations. Then you developed a report
What we heard?
in terms of what we heard, in terms of what we all heard, and then there was some responses to that, right? So that people could understand what the thinking is and what we as a council kind of agreed to. I'm assuming, Mr. Spear, that we will be developing a sort of a schedule in January?
Yeah, well, so staff are meeting this week actually
Yeah.
to discuss it, to try to set up kind of the framework for it. That
Okay.
will maybe even, we're meeting Wednesday?
Yeah,
Yeah,
Wednesday.
maybe we'll include it with the package, what we're thinking, and have it up for discussion on the Monday meeting if this kind of works with everybody. It's just, we're trying to set dates and stuff and line it up and see what everybody thinks. We will be pressed to find a location in Shamcook, though, because where we had it previously, I don't think they use for the winter. So if Councillor Harlan wants to have a housewarming and have everybody over? No? Okay.
Let me think about that.
Okay. But otherwise, yeah, we may not be able to have one on that side of the 127, but if anyone knows of a potential location, please let us know.
But I think that, I think people are very understanding about that in the winter months and would respond to Bayside and town.
Okay. Thank you. All right.
All right, I'll get out of your hair and you can have your other meeting.
Well, thank you.
What are you meeting about?
The rest of our
Yeah, run now.
initiatives, it's 10 pages.
Okay, so we're on F, which is introduction, consideration and passing of bylaws and motions. I don't see anything written down, so we don't have anything.
You can
New
jump right to adjournment,
business.
can't you?
We don't have anything. Question period. Any questions from the gallery? No, they're just waving at us. Any questions online, Sir Mac? No?
No, no
Okay.
questions online or on Zoom.
Thank you very much. And now we're up to councilors and deputy mayor's comments. Thanks, Xander. Safe drive. Any comments, council? No? Okay, then it's the mayor's comments, and I'd just like to thank the fire department for a wonderful parade, and I actually got my ride in a fire truck, although you couldn't see me in it, but, because I'm so short, and getting into it was I think the fire chief said, I don't know if you're gonna be able to climb up there, but I did it just to spite him. So I got in there, and I waved, and I said Merry Christmas, so we had a great time, and then Santa came to the W.C. O'Neill Arena, so it was kind of nice. And so I'd like to thank the firemen for helping me into the truck. And I want to thank again for the bags that we received, because I was over to the food bank and they were just so happy, even for the small paper bags, because now they could take a 50-pound bag and sort it out, and it could go to many people. So that was really nice. But they still need, turkey vouchers and all that to make Christmas a special time for the people that don't have as much as the rest. So keep on sending. Thank you. And do we have a closed session for tonight? No closed session tonight. Then the next thing is adjournment. Counselor Heenan and Counselor Bennett. So at 7:14, we are adjourned. Thank you for coming.